Hi and welcome to another one of my videos on my radio control trucks. Hope this whole COVID-19 dilemma has got you all home and safe at least, and if not working on your radio control buggies or trucks, at least spending some quality time with the family. So today I thought I'd talk about one of my non-Range Rover radio control trucks for a change. As you all would remember from my earlier videos, I've already built one Range Rover and there's a second one on the way, which is to be based on a slightly more performance-oriented chassis with slightly better tires, etc. I'm going to introduce you to the truck that actually got me started on the idea to build that second Range Rover, and effectively would actually provide me with more performance rather than just pure scale looks. Having said that, I've got to say that I'm always about the body shells. I'm always about making things as realistic as possible. And that really stems from the fact that the initial draw card for me for these crawlers was in fact how realistic their body shells look. In terms of the Lexan body shells that many people use, I've got to say that I'm really not somebody who prescribes to the performance over the looks type of thing, simply because of where I came from. Historically, I was much more of an on-road radio control racing car type of person. Much more interested in things like performance, interested in speed, handling, and looks always were a very secondary part of things for me. So here is one of the 1/8 cars that I used to race a couple of years ago. These things were all about aerodynamics. Without this sort of shell, these cars could not handle at all. So everyone basically had to use the same type of body shell. These shells just looked like a wedge. They looked like a doorstop, but they really handled well. Based off that, the only thing we could ever do was make them as brightly colored as possible so we could see them on the track, because these tracks were very large, and essentially differentiate ourselves from the other drivers. The shells themselves, very disposable, because in the heat of competition, you'd always end up hitting other people will end up hitting you, and these shells would not last very long at all. And therefore, we never spent a lot of time painting them, we never spent a lot of time detailing these shells, and we honestly didn't care about how they looked that much. But this is in very stark contrast to what I saw when I first explored the RC crawler scene and when I started to see the trucks, on Instagram. The detail, the level of artwork, of actual scale modeling that was required to get these trucks to look as detailed and as realistic as possible was something that really drew me to the RC crawler scene. And in fact, I've got to say that this really held something very dear to me, simply because when I was a young kid, one of my other favorite things was to do model cars, was to make model kit cars as opposed to radio control cars, was to make model military. So the scale model building is something that I find so attractive when it comes to the crawler scene. We can express ourselves in terms of the body shells. We can actually really make a very realistic scale looking body, and the best part about them is these shells last. They're made to last. They're made to be a part of the car forever. You don't typically change the body shells out the way we would in the on-road racing scene. When we build a truck, or when I used to see at least people building trucks on Scale Builders Guild, etc., they really went all out and they kept the shells as well as possible. Now, in this specific case of this model that I'm actually going to be describing today, this is a bit of a runner. Actually, all of my trucks that I'm building are a bit of runners. So as much as I spend a lot of time building and detailing them, they do get scratched, they do get scuffed, but by and large, they will never be replaced. So the shells, once put onto a particular model or put onto a particular chassis, stay there forever. Or at least that is my impression and my intention at the same time. After building the Range Rover that we have shown on previous videos, I decided, as I mentioned just a bit earlier, it was time to build something with a bit more of a reference point. To have a chassis that really explained to me what a good RC crawler handled like. After a bit of research, I'd identified that there were some nice, relatively basic chassis kits, such as the Traxxas TRX4, that actually had handling levels beyond the axial SCX 10.2 that I'd done on the first Range Rover. But a lot of these were still very, very heavily upgraded when I looked at them. People would still spend a lot of money actually detailing them, etc., which was wonderful, but more than that, they spent a lot of money on the chassis. I wanted to make sure that this time around, when I got myself a chassis, that this specific chassis that I got would be one that had all the hop-up bits on it already, that was essentially a chassis that was ready to go. And I could then try driving, I could learn how to crawl with, and in the end, I would actually understand what a reference was for a top-level crawler. This resulted in me picking up a Vanquish VS410. Now, at the time, there was the VS410 Origin, there was also the VS410 Pro and the Ultra. The VS410 Origin being the earlier incarnation of the Vanquish product line, was basically a chassis that had all the hop-up bits that Vanquish had produced for the axial SCX 10.2 put into one specific chassis. The chassis had the overall fundamentals of the VS410, but it still did not yet have the much more hardened, rigid plastic parts that the later incarnation of the VS410 Pro and the VS410 Ultra had. I decided I would not go with the VS410 Origin simply because of the chassis flex. Coming from, again, that performance on-road radio control world, I wanted a chassis that was stiff, rigid, and allowed the suspension to do all the work. That left the Ultra and the Pro. The Ultra is a chassis that uses the portal system. So these allow for better ground clearance, but they push the overall truck higher. And in pushing the overall truck higher, they ultimately increase the center of gravity. And when the CG is higher, truck is more capable of rolling, handles less well when you're trying to crawl and climb up much more steep gradients, for example. So as a result of that, I decided that what I would do instead was to purchase the VS410 Pro, but true to my ethos of wanting a realistic looking truck, I would not use the polycarbonate shell that came with it, but rather use a detailed hard body. In this case, a body that I purchased from a company called Loops, a European company, of the Toyota Hilux, twin cab, and I would put in a full interior. The full interior itself did not come with this body shell, but instead was a interior that I'd purchased, if I remember correctly, from RC 4-wheel drive. Being that this body shell and the interior was not made for the Vanquish, a fair bit of cutting needed to be done. Firstly, I needed to cut the arches front and rear quite dramatically because I wanted to make sure that I could maintain large size tires to ensure handling of the VS410 Pro chassis was always kept to a maximum. As well as that, I decided that in this particular situation, I would be using the Proline Hyrax tires as well as the Method wheels that come from Vanquish. So these, probably besides the body shell, are the only real modifications that were made to the VS410 Pro out of the box. The body shell itself, as always for me, painted initially using the Tamiya TS paints. These paints were then added to with weathering, etc., that was used from an airbrush. But the interior was required to be altered. And the reason for this was due to the fact that the chassis mounts the battery in the rear, right near where the rear seats are, and along the frontal part where the transmission sits and pushes the motor very low, it still impinges somewhat on the front part of the transmission tunnel within the body shell. This in turn meant that I had to do a fair bit of cutting, but I had to come up with a solution whereby I could still maintain the rear seats, or at least the appearance of the rear seats, without a huge gaping hole showing a battery. And it was quite fortunate that a company by the name of CC Hand makes seat covers for the RC four-wheel drive range of body shells. And these seat covers fit very nicely over these seats here. And even if I was to cut the underside of the chairs or seats, let me just show you what I mean by that. You can see it here. Even if it's all cut away, what has actually happened is because of the seat fabric, I am able to maintain a simulation of a seat. You can actually see that goes straight through to the interior. But this seat cover is shaped very well to match where the seat would otherwise have been. So the battery sits there and is covered and concealed very well. The front part of this body shell had to be cut away to allow for the VFD transmission to clear the interior, because I really wanted to use an interior. While we're at it, I might as well also show you the rest of the body shell. We had to cut away the rear deck here, and that was to clear the suspension mounts. On the top side of that, I built out of polystyrene a box, covered it in some material, weathered it so that ultimately it just looked like there was some storage space here covered with some weatherproof / waterproof type of material. The mounting system on this body shell was magnets front and magnets rear. The reason to use magnets as opposed to screwing this thing down was simply because I wanted to be able to service this truck on the trail should I need to do so. Servicing the truck was only because this specific chassis that I was using and this truck that I was building was going to be used for more technical type of driving, was to be used in situations where I anticipated there was going to be a lot more driving, as opposed to just taking videos and just looking at the scale appearance of the trucks, which was what I was doing with the Range Rover. So I wanted to always be able to access the underside to make sure I was always checking on the mechanicals to make sure everything worked. With the shell off, you can notice that this VS410 is very standard, as I alluded to earlier. The only differences being the wheels, and actually just one more key item here, besides the wheels and tires, is at the back at the moment. On the temporary side, I've got an old Axial SCX 10.2 bumper. Now this truck, I was running it without a bumper, but it was damaging the rear of the body shell a fair bit, and every once in a while, because of the very long overhang of the rear shell, it would catch. And every time it caught, it would have a lift off from the magnets. Now, the body shell wouldn't come off, but it was always on the verge of wanting to come off on very steep ascents, for example. So I decided to put a bumper on, and the only one I could find that would push out far enough out the back to protect the shell was from the Axial SCX 10.2 kit that I had sitting around. This bumper will probably be replaced at some point in time, as it just doesn't seem to fit in with the overall look of the truck, but for now it serves a very functional purpose. At the front, I'm still using the original Vanquish bumper, simply because this bumper has got fantastic clearance. I also mentioned earlier that this truck uses the flat axles, the original flat axles, as opposed to the portals, and these really help with center of gravity. So from my perspective, definitely the VS410 Pro is a better car if you are looking for a technical driving machine as opposed to a trailing type of truck. The truck on top of that has a Reefs RC 555 servo, because I wanted to make sure I had all the steering capability that was required of this truck. I've also got a Holmes Hobby Puller Pro motor inside. Let me just get a bit closer to show you what this overall transmission looks like. So as you can see, that's the transmission. It's a really, really nice and low transmission. The motor is kept at the absolute lowest position. So from that perspective, CG is everything for this particular vehicle. And that's really, really impressive. The transmission itself it's totally robust, and it just sits so low. On top of that, you can see that the batteries itself, they sit down here. They work together with the overall chassis and hold the chassis together very, very rigidly. In the rear, you can see this is where the receiver sits, and on top of that, I've actually used a shock mount from a touring car together with attached rare earth magnets to mount the rear of the body shell. One of the key fundamental designs that I love about the Vanquish as well is a very high clearance of the chassis rails. In the front, you can see they arch up very high, allowing for a lot of suspension travel. And this actually is the same, in fact, if you look at it, for the rear. The very significant arching of the chassis rails really provides with substantial enhancement of travel for the suspension. The shock absorbers here are the incisions that come with the kit, and they are really, really fantastic. No leaks, nothing at all. You can see that there's a very smooth drivetrain underneath, no overhangs, very strong central drive shafts, perfectly designed as far as I'm concerned. In the end, a chassis can make a world of difference, as can the tires, to how enjoyable a truck is. Whether or not that truck is a scale truck or it's going to be a truck that ultimately you've got a Lexan body shell on, no matter what, you do want a good chassis underneath. Now, I've got to admit that I'm in the process of building a couple of other scale trucks where I'm not going to be using such high-end chassis, or I will be using chassis that are actually much more scale. For example, I'll be building a Defender in due course, and you all will see that soon, based off a C-Max, a GCM C-Max chassis. Definitely, as far as I'm concerned, nowhere near going to have the handling of the Vanquish VS410 Pro, but it's just a scale look, so that would serve a different purpose. If I want technical driving, this is the truck I go to. Nothing else compares to it. And that is exactly the reason why ultimately I ended up with the build of the second Range Rover, wherein I'm using a VS410 chassis. And in fact, the chassis itself is I would say a mix of a VS410 Origin together with a VS410 Ultra, because it uses the portals, it uses the stiffer chassis plate of the VS410 later design, but against that, it's still using the SCX 10.2 style of transmission. I hope you all have enjoyed this little quick tour of this truck, my workhorse, and that you can see that there really can be a compromise between performance and looks. It doesn't always have to be a Lexan shell. It doesn't always have to be all about performance. I mean, to me, that's the beauty of RC crawling. It's slow enough where you can put some really good shells on there without damaging them. And as long as you're smart about your choice, in this case, for example, using a shell that's slightly lighter than I had compared to the Range Rover, it's a flatbed at the back, so it's reduced the CG because there's no roof there. It doesn't have to impact the handling as badly as a full outright hard body such as the Range Rover. And yet, it has a far better look than if I was to just put on a standard Lexan body shell on top of this thing with a paint from the inside. So that's the compromise, and I think that's where I'm going to be at the end. Almost all my trucks are going to be realistic, are going to have hard shells. There's possibly going to be one truck that I will build that will use a polycarbonate shell, the Lexan shell that came with this VS410 Pro originally, and that one will be a pure performance build. I'm going to see how far I can take a pure performance RC crawler, and that'll be a completely separate project. But by and large, all the trucks that you'll be seeing me building over the coming months are all going to have hard shells, even if they are performance oriented, such as this one, which has the VS410 Pro chassis. Really do hope that you all enjoy this. Please do take care of yourselves in this really, really crazy time. And I look forward to sharing more of my trucking obsession with you all very soon. Thank you all for watching.